A few years ago, Audi was building some of the best SUVs, well, ever really. Cars like the Q7 from 2015 and the Q5 a year or so after might have looked pretty conservative, but they were incredibly well engineered and objectively put all of their premium badge rivals to shame. The company's latest SUVs, the Q4 and Q6 e-tron, aren't quite so special though. Don't get me wrong, they are good cars. If you told me you wanted to buy either, I definitely wouldn't try to talk you out of it. It's just that they aren't the very best cars in their classes. But Audi might be about to return to class-leading form, because this is the new Audi Q5, and in this video I'm going to be driving it on-road, off-road, finding out how practical it is and seeing if the interior is up to scratch. So stay watching and don't forget to subscribe for lots more videos like this one. Now let's start with where the Q5 slots into Audi's lineup, because that used to be very straightforward, but it's now a little more complicated. So this still sits above the Q3 and below the Q7, and like both of those cars, the Q5 has petrol and diesel engines under its bonnet. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there is also now the Q4 and Q6. They also straddle the Q5 for size, but they are fully electric cars. In fact, until a few weeks ago, it was Audi's plan to use odd numbers for its combustion engine cars and even numbers for its electric models. But it's now decided that was a terrible idea, and as a sign of what's to come, the A6 replacement that we're driving in a few weeks' time will actually be called the A6 after all. It was originally going to be badged up as an A7. So there will be a fully electric A6 e-tron and a combustion engine A6 as well, and that will hopefully make it easier for people who have been familiar with Audi's lineup for decades to understand. So we know the Q5 has petrol and diesel engines under its bonnet, but what exactly are they? Well, in this car there is a 2-litre turbocharged petrol with 201 brake horsepower, but for around £1,600 extra you can have a 2-litre diesel. That has exactly the same amount of power, but it has more torque and, as you probably expect, it's more economical. Or if that isn't enough power for you, there's also this hot SQ5 version. It has a 3-litre V6 petrol engine with 362 brake horsepower, and it can do 0 to 62 in just 4.5 seconds. A plug-in hybrid version will also be joining the lineup later this year, and that's probably worth waiting for if you're a company car driver paying benefit in kind tax. But whichever engine you go for, you can choose between the so-called regular SUV version and this swoopier looking sportback with its coupe-like rear end. There are some minor practicality compromises with this car that I'll talk you through later, but the main reason you might just want to stick with the regular SUV is because this sportback costs around £2,500 extra. And the Q5 isn't cheap to begin with, because prices start at pretty much bang on £50,000. Although these days that is about the same as a BMW X3, and it's actually slightly cheaper than an equivalent Mercedes GLC. If you want the SQ5, you'll be spending around £75,000. That's about the same as a Porsche Macan GTS. And if you're thinking that's quite punchy, well, it's because the SQ5 is only available in range-topping Edition 1 trim, so you get loads of standard equipment. On the Macan, you get 4 wheels and a seat, but that's about your lot. Now, this might look fairly similar to the previous generation Q5. It's an evolution of that design rather than a drastic change, but it actually sits on heavily revised underpinnings. So this is the first SUV on Audi's new PPC platform, or Premium Platform Combustion. That debuted on the A5 late last year, and it will also be used on future models, including the Q7. It isn't an entirely new platform. Audi still plans to have a fully electric lineup in just a few years' time, but it has allowed Audi to fit some more advanced mild hybrid tech, and I'll talk you through that when we go for a drive in a bit. But before we go for a drive, let's have a look around inside the Q5, and visually at least, it is quite similar to the latest Q6, because you've got this big curved piece of glass here that stretches across half of the dashboard, and that actually houses 2 displays. So there is an 11.9-inch virtual cockpit behind the steering wheel here. Audi's had one of those for years now, and then there is a 14.5-inch touchscreen in the middle of the dashboard for the infotainment functions. On this particular car, as you may have noticed, there is also a third screen that measures 10.9 inches. That is a touchscreen, and it means your passenger can watch YouTube or play around with radio stations while you're driving along. And if you think that's probably going to be quite distracting for the driver, don't worry about it, because when you're driving along you can't actually view it from this side of the car because it's polarized. Now, it's not the first time we've seen this sort of arrangement. It's in the latest Porsche Taycan, for example, And actually in Range Rovers going back 20 years, they had screens that when you were watching the TV, you couldn't view them from the driver's seat. But it is a nice thing to have. The only thing is that you have to go for range topping edition 1 trim in the UK to get that. You can't add it as an option to the cheaper trim levels. Now this screen in the middle here is pretty good by touchscreen standards. It is nice and bright, it's high up, it's quick to respond, not too much of a delay between you pressing icons and what you want actually happening. Inevitably it is a touchscreen, so it's more distracting to use while driving than a rotary controller would be. But most manufacturers have dropped those now. Even BMW is getting rid of its iDrive rotary controller because of the complexity and the cost it adds, even though it definitely aids usability while you're driving. There are also no physical air conditioning controls in the new Q5, so to adjust the interior temperature you have to either use these little icons down here at the bottom or the voice control system, so that's not really ideal. But what's even more disappointing, I'd say, is the quality of this interior. Now, Audi used to build the best quality interiors in the business. There is absolutely no question about that. It's not bad in here. There are some bits trimmed in leather that you'll touch regularly. The dashboard is soft, but also look at this bit of trim up here behind the steering wheel. The tolerances of that gap are very big. But Audi is certainly not the only manufacturer that is reducing the quality of its interiors. If you look at the latest BMW X3, for example, that is a big step down compared with the old model. And the Mercedes GLC isn't great inside either. So it does definitely seem premium German manufacturers just don't really care that much about interior quality anymore. Whether that matters and whether that will affect sales is really down to you. But what I would say is if the quality of the interior really matters to you, maybe take a look at the Porsche Macan. That has been around for donkey's years, but still has a very nice interior, or the Lexus NX. There are lots of positives in here though. Storage is actually better than in the previous generation Q5 thanks to a bigger cubby under this central armrest. There are still 2 cup holders there just next to the gear selector. There's a tray with a wireless phone charger down here, and also the door bins are a decent size. On top of that, you've got a very nice driving position in the new Q5. You sit high up, the seats are very comfortable and supportive, and everything lines up nicely. And although it's very difficult to see the top of this virtual cockpit because the rim of the steering wheel blocks it, Audi's obviously aware of that, so it hasn't put important information at the very top of the screen here. As you can see, that speedo has its top half chopped off, so really it's not a problem at all. So overall, although the new Q5 is a little bit disappointing for interior quality, it does have lots of infotainment tech and a great driving position. Now, when a new version of an existing model gets launched, it's a pretty safe bet that it's going to be bigger than the car it replaces, especially if it sits on new or at least heavily updated underpinnings, as this car does. And sure enough, this is a bigger car than the old Q5, but really, we're not talking much at all. It's only 3.5 centimeters longer, and almost all of that is because of longer overhangs at the front and the rear. In fact, the wheelbase, or the distance between the front and the rear wheels, has only grown by 9 millimeters. And what that means is space in the back here is very similar to what it was before. So this is a practical family SUV. I am just over 6 feet tall. I've been driving this car today, so this seat is set up for my driving position. And as you can see, there is plenty of space for my knees. What's also handy is that you can slide these seats forward. So if I have kids in the back here and I want to free up a bit more space in the boot, I can do just that. I can also recline the angle of this backrest for a more laid back seating position. What's not quite so good is headroom, although even if I sit bolt upright, my head isn't quite touching the ceiling there. And remember, this is the Sportback version with its more coupe-like rear end. I sat in the SUV version of the new Q5 earlier, and I'm happy to report that headroom is even better. So really, the only slightly annoying thing is this enormous tunnel down here on the floor. So even though the Q5 is plenty wide enough to seat 3 people in the back, whoever draws the short straw and ends up in the middle is going to have to straddle that enormous tunnel, and that is quite annoying. Now the boot, unsurprisingly, is also about the same size as the old Q5s, and that means that in this Sportback version there is 515 litres of space under this load cover here, and that's with the rear seat slid all the way back as they are now. If you go for the SUV version, then you get an extra 5 litres of space. So the space on offer here is roughly the same as it is in a BMW X3. That doesn't tell the whole story though, because if you move this load cover out of the way, you will see that in the Sportback version, the load bay is quite shallow towards the very rear of the car, certainly more so than it is in the SUV version of the Q5. Anyway, on the subject of the load cover, it is pretty handy that you can remove it and store it under the boot floor here. There is also some extra space down there for other bits and bobs you want to keep out of the way. You also get 40-20-40 split folding rear seats, and what that means is that you can put a passenger on each of the outer seats and slot something long in between, like a pair of skis or maybe a couple of golf travel bags. If you had a traditional 60-40 split, then both of your passengers will be crammed together on that 60% side. And what's also handy is that to fold down these rear seats, you don't have to walk around, open the rear door and pull the seat forward yourself. You just pull these handy levers on the walls of the boot. So overall, the Q5's boot is pretty decent for a family SUV, although it is worth noting that if you're waiting for the plug-in hybrid version during the summer, then that is likely to have a smaller boot than this. Audi hasn't said how small, but based on the previous generation version, you're likely to lose around 10% of your luggage space. So that mild hybrid technology I was talking about earlier, it isn't quite as mild as it is on some cars, because there's a relatively big 1.7 kilowatt hour battery, and that feeds something called a powertrain generator that essentially acts as a small motor to assist the petrol engine. And it doesn't just help out at very low speeds when you're pulling away, it can work at up to 87 miles an hour. And if you're really gentle with the accelerator pedal at low speeds for very short distances, it can drive the car along using just battery power. So really, this is a halfway house between a mild hybrid like the BMW X3 and a full hybrid like the Lexus NX350h. And it really does help fuel economy, because even this 2-litre petrol can officially do more than 40 miles to the gallon if you stick with entry-level sport trim. If you go for the 2-litre diesel, that can officially do more than 47 mpg. Not bad for a fairly big, heavy SUV with more than 200 brake horsepower. And the best thing is, the technology doesn't ruin drivability. This is actually a really easy car to drive smoothly. The brakes aren't grabby, and it's more than quick enough. This can do 0 to 62 in around about 7 seconds. Now, if you go for entry-level sport trim, you'll get something called comfort suspension for your Q5, whereas if you go for S-Line or Edition 1, then you get sport suspension. And as the name suggests, the sport suspension is a bit firmer, and it should help make the Q5 a bit more agile, probably at the expense of comfort. But we haven't tried either of those setups yet. We've only tried the optional air suspension that costs £1,725 in the UK and is only available on S-Line and Edition 1 trims. I can't tell you if it's worth paying extra for, because as I say, we haven't tried the standard suspension setups yet, but what I can say is this air suspension delivers a really comfortable ride, even if you go for the 21-inch alloys fitted to this car that are the biggest that you can have. Yes, we are driving this car in southern Spain and the roads are generally better than they are in the UK, but as long as you've got the suspension in comfort mode, this is a plusher riding car than the BMW X3 and the Mercedes GLC. And if you switch to dynamic mode, then the suspension drops the car 15mm closer to the road. And this actually handles really well for a family SUV. Not much body lean at all, even along these mountain roads, plenty of grip, and the steering is accurate too. I do prefer the steering in comfort mode rather than dynamic though, because in dynamic it's a little bit heavy and a little bit unnecessarily gloopy. So yeah, I wouldn't describe this as fun, and maybe if that's your #1 priority, take a look at a Porsche Macan. But for most buyers in this class, this offers a really great ride and handling balance. And that air suspension doesn't only lower the car, it can also lift it. So if I switch to off-road mode here on the infotainment screen, then the front of the car is jacked up by 32mm and the rear of the car by 30mm to give the Q5 more ground clearance. So clearly this isn't a Jeep Wrangler, and most owners are never going to take their Q5 off-road at all. But if you do need to get up a rocky track like this, or perhaps across a muddy field, you'll find the Q5 more capable than you might expect. Now, this is the first time we've driven the new Q5, and we've only tried one version of it with air suspension, so it's hard to be conclusive about how it compares with a BMW X3 and a Mercedes GLC. That will have to wait for a group test back in the UK, and if you hit subscribe, we'll let you know as soon as that video goes live. What I can tell you though is that although the Q5 is perhaps a little bit disappointing for interior quality, it is more than practical enough, and it's actually very good to drive by class standards.